Welcome back, everybody. This week we're going to be picking up where we left off, talking about how the Enlightenment as a philosophical, social, and political movement leads to the experience of political revolution in the world. It's going to be great. Okay, so here we go. From Enlightenment to Revolution, Part 2. Okay, so last week we talked a little bit about the salon, which was that sort of cultural phenomenon where well-to-do, and it did tend to be well-to-do, sometimes middle class, and by that I mean wealthy but not noble people in France, sometimes actual titled people as high as the mistress of the King of France, Louis XV's mistress, the Marquise de Pompadour, were very famous for hosting these things called salons, which were basically tea parties where people would gather together and then they would have discussions. And often they'd host somebody like Voltaire or an artist or somebody who had interesting and exciting philosophical and political ideas that they could then share with the group. And it was perceived as very safe. It was the kind of thing where you could talk about daring and exciting ideas without really getting into any danger or any trouble. If you're having the same kind of conversations about whether the church should exist or be backed by the government, or whether absolute monarchy constitutes tyranny or not. If you were having that kind of a discussion among a bunch of men in a tavern, that would be politically very dangerous to do. You could end up arrested for sedition. But this was perceived at the salon level as something that was daring but inherently safe. Nobody was threatened by a bunch of ladies having their tea party. And this, in the end, was quite deceptive because what happened is that those ideas ended up becoming more normalized. They became something that people could hear discussed without flipping out about. They started trickling out of the salon, and books by Voltaire and others were being published without being heavily attacked and censored and squashed by the powers that be in France. And so what started out as a kind of sort of daring entertainment for the elite ended up being quite a sort of a dangerous flirtation with an opening up of ideas about everything from politics to religion to social structure, the rights of man, the structure of the cosmos. Everything ends up starting to be expressed and discussed in new and exciting ways. The putti are kind of dancing and flying around in the background. There are also, it does have some of the same elements of people all sort of milling around. This particular subject matter is people going to a fanciful island and having a picnic or a party or something. You get a lot of that. People cavorting around in nature. What's different, however, is the role that nature plays in the painting. If you look closely at this picture, for instance, the trees, how they're depicted, the hillside itself, it's all very much large and centered. It's the trees are really very much in focus, whereas many of the people are not. And they overarch, and you have this kind of dark foliage shadowing over people. And you have people kind of emerging from the background in among the vegetation. And all of this is meant to communicate an idea. You'll see that here in this next painting as well. This one very famously on the left is Fragonard's The Swing, very famous. And you get the same kind of idea. The trees are this overwhelming dominant force that creates this shadowy landscape where there's little bits of light that kind of shine through. And you have, of course, the subject of it is this lovely young woman. But in the background, you have some statues and sort of neoclassical elements, but you also have these two men who are kind of overwhelmed and hiding in among this foliage. Well, there's a design element of this that's quite deliberate. In contrast to what Louis XIV's preference was, where it was all mirrors, all open, everyone's being watched by the king all the time, what the Rococo explores is the idea that nature is perhaps not so tameable, that it will overwhelm, that it's bigger than the people, and that it creates this environment of potential for chaos, for naughtiness. In the case of the swing, with Fragonard, what's happening here is quite risque. You have this lovely young woman dressed up fancy. She's on the swing. She's got a couple of young men who are with her, one of whom's pulling the ropes of the swing. The other is kind of reclining in the bushes there. And she's swinging. Her little shoe comes flying off. You can see it kind of going off there. And the young man who's in the bushes is, of course, looking right up her skirt. And so the whole idea of this is really quite this risque moment that's happening in this environment of secrecy created by nature that is, in fact, not tamed at all. And the message of this really kind of not very subtle message that comes across in paintings like this, which rich people were lining up to buy, was, of course, that there is no complete transparency. There's no way the king can see what's going on all the time. Stuff is happening secretly, quietly, where you can't see it. The storm is coming. There's this kind of motion of nature as unstoppable, as preparing to overwhelm whatever it is we're trying to impose on it. Those ideas are very much characteristic of this time period right before the American Revolution and right before the French Revolution. And you see it creeping through in popular art. You see it creeping through in popular literature. You also see it creeping directly in political treatises and works that are written by John Locke and Thomas Paine and others that explore this notion of nature as the guiding, the single dominant force that will ultimately have its way, and that our efforts to try to pervert the course of that when we try to interfere with people's, say, natural rights, are ultimately doomed to failure. And so this is just a moment, it's worth taking a moment to look at this as a movement that is essentially a political rebellion that becomes popular and mainstream as an aesthetic expression. You see that with architecture as well. This is one of the more famous of them, the Kaiserl residence in Würzburg in Germany, where in architecture it's very it's like the Baroque, where it's very, very decorative. But unlike earlier Baroque architecture that we would have seen under Louis XIV, the form of it starts looking more and more organic. The pillars will look like trees, and the decorations will look like vines and just nature exploding and uncontrollable and just taking off and going crazy. So that becomes very popular at this time as well. Okay. So, on a quick little pivot here, we're going to take a moment and we're going to kind of jump scene and talk about some other things that are building at this time period as well. And one of the places we really have not focused on in lecture up until this point is Russia. Part of that is simply for practical reasons. There's only so much time in class, so you can't do everything all at once. And part of that has to do with the fact that right for the last several centuries that we've covered in class, Russia is very much part of Europe's economy. It's kind of part of the communications, and it's not as though Russia has been isolated from Europe in any meaningful way. There's still trade, there's still communication, people are still traveling. However, from the Black Death onward, a lot of the changes that we saw in Western Europe, where the economy stops being quite so agricultural, towns grow up and become more important. You have the Protestant Reformation. You have all those changes we've been talking about all through the semester up until this point. A lot of that's really kind of not happening to the same extent in Russia. Russia is also separate from many Western European countries for a few other reasons as well. There's not very many people in Western Europe who speak Russian. They also, in Russia, have the Russian Orthodox Church, which is their sort of national church that they worship at, and they don't use the same calendar as Western Europe. There's sort of a lot of cultural division that had been there traditionally. And so we haven't really talked about Russia, but we're going to start because some of those divisions begin to be broken down in the 17th century. And the guy who's going to be responsible for breaking a lot of them down is pictured here at the time when he was first crowned as emperor in Russia. This is Peter the Great. He's going to take the throne unofficially when he's quite young. He's just a young child. However, he's going to rule jointly with his half-brother and his sister, and his mother is going to be the regent and overlook all of that. And it's not going to be for some time until he is going to actually take over Russia altogether. When he does do this in the 1690s, when this actually happens, and he's in his 20s and he takes over Russia, he's going to have a very deliberate um, uh, policy. He's going to have a very deliberate plan to try to bring Russia closer to Western Europe, politically and economically. And in order to do that, what Peter does is really right after he becomes kind of the sole monarch of Russia, he's going to go on something called the Grand Embassy. He organizes this, I guess, the state visit from Russia to Western Europe. It's going to visit a whole bunch of different countries. He's going to spend a lot of time in the Netherlands and as well as in England. He's going to pass through France. He's going to talk to as many people as he possibly can. And the goal of this is to find out what it is that Western European countries, particularly the Netherlands and England, are doing to encourage their maritime shipping economies. He's very interested in technology of the new ships and docks and all of the stuff that's being used, the new mechanics. He's very interested in military technology. He's very interested in all of the things where he feels Russia is lagging behind Western Europe. He's also very interested in some of the political structures of Western Europe, particularly the absolute monarchy of Louis XIV. Louis XIV is still the king at this point. At the Grand Embassy, and he's very much going to be a role model for Peter the Great. Get to that in just a bit. But anyways, he organizes this Grand Embassy, and it's supposed to be a bunch of highfalutin Russian nobles with sort of an imperial guard that goes with them to be their security force, etc. And what Peter intends, I suppose, is that he himself will travel with this and lead this embassy, but he's going to do it incognito. That was his plan. It's really not clear exactly how many people believed this and bought it, because Peter was not an inconspicuous person. By the time he reaches adulthood and goes on the Grand Embassy, he is at least, and figures vary a bit, but he's at least 6'8". He's enormously tall and Russian and quite recognizable. And so I don't know how incognito this guy can get. He does attempt to conceal this a little bit, camouflage himself, by selecting 70 soldiers to be the bodyguard, to be like the guard that went with the group, who are as tall as he was or taller. So he had to scour Russia and find people who are over 6'8" to be in the military escort that went with this. I can only imagine how shocking this must have been to people as they saw this party of Russians show up, and they're all enormous. But at any rate, he disguises himself. He pretends he's not the Tsar. He travels with the Grand Embassy, and he goes around to shipyards in the Netherlands. He works as a shipbuilder for a while. He travels to England. They take up residence. They rent places. They trash the place. It's all very sort of infamous, the activities they get up to. But what he does is he uses this as an information gathering tour. And when he returns to Russia the next year, he is going to implement a lot of the things that he saw. He's going to attempt to absolutely drag Russia kicking and screaming into what he sees as the proper way of being a modern nation at this time. He uses France, the absolute monarchy of France, as his political model. What he's aiming for is something like absolute monarchy. It's not a real political possibility in Russia at this point, because Russian nobles still have too much influence and too much power to totally cut them out in the way that Louis XIV had been doing. He also is going to try to make Russia a more appealing trade partner to the West. He reopens trade with England. It had been cut off after the English Civil War, because the Russian monarchy did not approve of the whole executing the King of England thing. But at this point, there's the restoration is in place, and he's going to bring back and open up trade with England again. He's also going to try to make the court, places where diplomatic visitors would go and interact with the Russian government, he's going to try to make it look more European. He's going to insist that people who attend him at court dress in European fashions, that they learn to speak European languages, particularly French. He's really obsessed with France and Louis XIV, and so he wants his court to show how cultured they are by attending French plays and reading French philosophy and speaking in French when they're at court in Russia, and dressing in French clothes and wearing French hairstyles. So much, and to such an extent that, in fact, he forbids his nobles from wearing big, heavy, solid beards, which was the fashion at the time. It was traditional in Russia for Russian noblemen to wear a big, full beard. It was supposed to express their masculinity and virility and power and all that kind of stuff. And so that was traditional. But he says, no, 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 that's not being done in Europe, and we don't want to look like a bunch of backwater hicks. So we're not going to do that either. And if you object to me telling you to shave off your beard, you can keep your beard, but you have to pay an extra tax of 100 rubles every year if you want to wear a beard, because I forbid it. The rest of us are all supposed to adopt European facial hair and head hair styles. So in addition to these relatively superficial things, Peter is going to make a lot of changes that are quite substantive. He's going to move his capital to St. Petersburg, so name it after himself. They're modest there. Because it's on the shores, it's on the sea, and he wants Russia's economy to start to move more toward trade. He's going to invest heavily and build a whole big, beautiful port city to be a new capital to sort of share with Moscow, which was the traditional capital. He's also going to invest enormously heavily in the Navy, in building ships, in building a merchant fleet. He's going to invest very heavily in organizing modern shipyards in order to make the most out of this trade that he's encouraging. He's going to, in addition to that, he's going to overhaul the military, modernizing it, enlarging it, trying to grow and make it competitive with the militaries that he has seen in the West. He's going to poach a bunch of officers, in fact, from Western European countries to come and train the new Russian military. He's going to build more modern buildings. He's going to create some scientific institutes. He's going to patronize the arts. He's going to pay for all kinds of things to try to bring Russia up to speed. He's going to reform the calendar. He's going to move Russia onto a calendar that is consistent with what they are using in Western Europe so that we can all be on the same page, the Julian calendar, literally, and so it's easier for trade and communication. And he's going to discourage things he sees as too traditional. He himself was quite devoutly religious, but he is going to really think poorly of an independent religious governance in Russia. He does not want or like the Russian church to be independent of his rule or his government. So he's going to break down the patriarchate in the Russian Orthodox Church and put together a council instead where he appoints all the bishops, their synod, and they get to make the decisions, but he's really pulling their strings. He also is going to try to pass a law and discourage any Russian man from joining a monastery until he's at least 50 years old, the argument being that it's a waste of labor and capital, potential capital, for all of these young, healthy men to be going into monasteries instead of working at various things they might work at. So he's going to do all of these things, and if you add that all up, building and modernizing a navy and a new modern army, building a new capital, making all of these sweeping changes, all of this costs a fortune, an absolute bleeding fortune. And so he is really going to be in a position where he has to get together enough money in order to make this happen. And how is he going to do that? Well, he's going to have to go to his nobles, the boyars, and he's going to have to ask them to raise that money through taxation. It's not a popular thing to do, raising taxes and raising money, and so in return, very much the same way we saw with England, where if you want to raise extra money, you have to go to Parliament, and Parliament has to convince their constituents, convince their people that they should pay an extra tax. In return for that, they're going to want something. They want concessions. And it's no different in Russia. In Russia, the boyars are like, okay, we'll make these changes that frankly we don't like that much, but we want something in return. And what they want in return is security. They want to be promised that they're not going to be completely squished out in the way that absolute monarchy is squishing out the role of the nobles in France. So what the boyars ask for and what Peter gives them is a more formal legal control over their serfs. They still have serfs in Russia. They don't have serfs in Western Europe. They've gone through that whole transformational process after the Black Death and the several centuries afterwards. But Russia really never did. It didn't change that much. And so they still have serfs, and the legal control that the nobles have over their serfs, over their peasants, becomes more strict as a result of Peter's reforms. So it's a little bit of a paradox. On the one hand, Peter the Great is pushing Russia toward modernization. On the other hand, he is pulling backwards to make sure that the common people, the peasant class, those people are more firmly under the thumb of a medieval system than ever they had been before. And so it's an interesting choice, and it's going to be one that in the long run, and it will take a while for this to come to a head, but in the long run, this is going to end up costing Russia significantly. Because what's happening here is that the modernization that takes place is not coming from the ground up. Instead, it's a modernization kind of from the middle to the top, with the peasant, the working class, being substantially left behind, and not just left behind, but pushed down in order to pay for it all. So this is going to cause some problems down the road, but it will be a while before they boil over. Okay, so over in France. France is starting to have some troubles. Louis XIV dies, as we mentioned. His successor is a child. When Louis XV grows up and takes the throne, it's pretty clear that things are not going to go super smoothly. Part of that is a personality issue. Louis XIV was a powerhouse of a person. He was somebody with a strong agenda. He was someone with a very clear vision for what he wanted. He was somebody with an absolutely unlimited ambition, and he had very big sweeping plans. Louis XV, his great-grandson, is not like that. He seems to have been a relatively quiet, shy sort of person by nature, and then he's thrust into the situation where he has to be king. He was very interested in things like clockmaking, and he really did not embrace his position. And then from the time he was a child, he was very much the tool of various political forces in France. Were trying to manipulate him constantly to do what they saw as good for their own interests. Also, he comes to the throne where a lot of people, as I mentioned at the beginning of this lecture, were looking for a chance to break the absolute monarchy apart, to break it down a little bit, in order to give themselves a little bit more breathing room. And so when you do this and you inherit as a child and everybody's looking to undermine your authority, it's very difficult to assert yourself. Even as an adult, Louis XV is going to struggle with that. He's also going to struggle with some pretty terrible decisions he keeps making. And as a result, France is going to end up in a bind. There's an assassination attempt, very famously, by Robert Damiens, where Louis XV was walking from one part of his palace to another part of his palace, and this guy breaks in the palace grounds and runs up and attempts to stab the king. And he does, in fact, stab the king, but it doesn't actually kill or even hurt him that badly, because the king was wearing a big heavy coat and a lot of layers of clothing, and the knife that Robert Damiens attempts to stab him with, it just wasn't long enough. It was like a 4 or 5 inch blade or something, and the king had so much clothing on that it scratched him, but didn't actually hurt him. But after this, Louis XV starts to get a little paranoid and nervous and afraid that this is happening all the time, so he authorizes some really kind of unwise decisions. He authorizes kind of a sort of a spy ring. It's not a particularly efficient one, where people's letters are being stolen and read, and of course nobles object to this and they don't really like it, and it makes him look bad and it makes him look weak because he's kind of scrambling around but he's not really accomplishing anything. He's also going to start meddling even further in British politics, which we'll get to in just a second. He's got some other major problems as well. France is looking relatively broke at this point. They've had a whole series of wars at the end of Louis XIV's life that cost a fortune. The empire is contracting a little bit. They've lost some ground. They're not bringing in the money the way that they originally were. And as a result, Louis XV is going to have some major problems. And the French people are sick and tired of a situation where they are paying just tons and tons and tons of money in extra taxes for more and more war. Meanwhile, the treasury, as it empties, does not necessarily have that big an impact on how Louis XV and his successor Louis XVI are starting to try to live their lives. If you remember what the palace at Versailles was like, everything huge, larger than life, overblown. The clothes were like layers and layers of luxury on top of luxury on top of luxury, and everything cost a fortune. Well, that worked out great for Louis XIV because he had a ton of money rolling in. But now the money's not there, and Louis XV is still trying to live like that. And it's becoming something that people resent more and more. How can you constantly be saying we've got no money when you are spending a Bentley worth of money on every outfit you wear? It was just something that people were resenting. And add into that all of that simmering, brewing kind of potential for change that was happening in every area of society. Several of the Parlement, now these are not like British Parliament, this is just a word that they use to talk about the provincial law courts in France. They're in charge of collecting taxes, and they refuse. They get more demands for tax increases, for tax money, and they're like, we're not doing it. We just won't do it. We expect to actually meet with the king and talk about what's going on here because you're spending all this money. Where is it going? We're sick and tired of it. We want to have some kind of more say over this. If you want us to raise money, we want to have some concessions, just like we saw with Russia, just like we've seen with England. Okay, so in order to explain some of the other terrible decisions that the King of France is going to make, Louis XV, let's back up a tiny bit and talk about what the situation is like in England. This is the situation that Louis XV is about to dip his toes into and get into trouble. Here's the quick recap. If you remember, we're backing way up now, what happened with the English Civil War? There was the Civil War, then after that there was the Restoration. Charles II was put back on the throne. He was the partier-in-chief guy. He dies without a legitimate heir. The throne passes to his brother James. James II is a Catholic, and Parliament decides they're not going to put up with this, so they have the Glorious Revolution, which was that bloodless coup where James has to flee to France, and William and Mary are brought to be the King and Queen of England. Now, they're Protestant. They're going to rule for some years with some success. However, eventually what happens, sadly enough, is that William and Mary are also going to die without a legitimate heir, a male heir to come after them. And so once they die, the throne is, then there's a question mark. What are we going to do with it? Because James II is clearly the person in line for the throne, but he's Catholic. He's been excluded. And so Parliament goes with the next kind of Protestant relative, and that is Mary's sister, Anne. And so Queen Anne takes the throne for 5 years. Her personal story is a little bit of a tragic one. She is married. She has a whole, just dozens of miscarriages and also early childhood deaths of a whole bunch of children. It was very tragic. It was very sad. And as a result of that, in 1707, she is also going to die without an heir. Now Parliament is going to have to really beat the bushes to come up with the next Protestant relative because most of this family is all Catholic. James is still alive and kicking. His son, Charles, Bonnie Prince Charlie, is also standing up, waving his hand, saying, I'd love to be King of England, but Parliament says, no, you're Catholic, we're not doing it. So they have to beat the bushes and dredge through whoever they've got to come up with a Protestant. And the nearest Protestant relative is George, the Elector of Hanover, which is one of those little German principalities. He's not a close relative at all. He's like a cousin. He's way down there on the sort of inheritance tree, if you will. And he speaks German, and he really has no strong connection to England. And yet Parliament's like, well, we've got to pick him because he's Protestant. So they inform him that he's going to be the new King of England. He travels to England and takes the throne. He is not popular. There was a good deal, a sort of wave of resentment of this move because it was hard to accept. It's like he doesn't even speak English. He learns, but he just wasn't somebody that everybody embraced, and especially people who were Catholic still in Britain, in Scotland, and in England, and Wales too. They see this as a moment. They're like, man, if we're ever going to rise up and put the James line back on the throne, the Jacobites, is how they come to be known. If we're ever going to rise up and put the Catholic branch back on the throne, now is the time to do it, while George is relatively unpopular and weak. They're going to be helped in this, if you want to consider it help, by encouragement from France. In 1715, France kind of secretly underground supports a group of rebels in Britain to rise up with the goal of putting James II back on the throne. And they're going to do it again in 1745, but this time more openly. Absolutely everybody knows this is what's going on. Officially, they're not actually involving themselves, but it becomes very clear when there's going to be a violent uprising, and the Scots in particular are going to be very much involved in this. They've all got French weapons, and they've got French money, and they're spending French coins, and they've got French materials to finance this whole uprising. It becomes really obvious that France is behind it. And here's the problem for France. Both of these uprisings fail. The one in 1745 was absolutely brutally suppressed. The Battle of Culloden was a massacre. People are rounded up and slaughtered as a result of being even suspected of having taken part in this. It was brutal, and it was bloody. It was awful. And once the dust had settled, the king was pretty ticked off at France. Diplomatic relations were extremely tense. It looked like war would break out between France and England at any time, largely over this, but there were other economic factors as well. They were interfering with each other's colonial territories. They were competing for market share when it came to their shipping empires. They had a lot going on, and it really looked like war was going to break out. So this was another thing that made Louis XV look, frankly, terrible as a leader. He's really messing things up diplomatically and economically. Okay, so mostly this is going to affect England first, but the rest of Europe as well. There are other factors that are contributing to this moment of tension as well, historically. There are some economic shifts in particular. In the early 1700s, there is this kind of broad movement that is sometimes referred to as an agricultural revolution. There were a lot of agricultural revolutions historically, but this particular one refers to kind of new improvements in agricultural techniques, field rotation, fertilization methods, various other things as well. And these improvements resulted in a great increase in productivity on farmland. This is going to take part first in Britain, where these experiments will be made, and then it will trickle down into Europe and be implemented in a lot of Western Europe as well. What it means is, because there's a great deal of increased productivity per acre, not as many acres have to be put into, say, wheat and oats and various other food products in order to produce enough food for everyone to have enough to eat. It's that law of supply and demand that we read about with Adam Smith, if you recall, where the more supply you have, the more oats and barley and whatnot go on the marketplace. It drives the price down. And so producing grain in a traditional way, using traditional tenant farmers on traditional, say, British estates, was no longer as profitable as once it had been. It wasn't necessarily the best way to make money off your land. And some landowners, it's not a huge proportion, but some landowners notice this. They're like, oh, well, if I'm not making as much money off of farming in the way that I have traditionally done it for hundreds of years, maybe I should look into figuring out how else I could turn a profit off my land. And one of the ways they could do that was through something called enclosure. Enclosure means, I guess, exactly what it sounds. If you take your land and instead of having it roughly be open farmland where you have a whole lot of tenant farmers who are working and living there, if instead you were to put a fence around it, say, you could then put in sheep. And if you did that, you could potentially enjoy a few advantages. First, the price of wool was high and just climbing higher and higher all the time. Part of the reason for that had to do with this picture over here on the right. Technology for textile production was taking off in the early 1700s and mid 1700s. It's going to be fused with some of the new technologies that are developed for steam power. This is Watt's steam engine that you see a picture of here. It's a huge version, in which, of course, you have a fire that heats up water. Water turns into steam. Steam will then be used to move pistons and various other mechanical pieces that you can do anything you want with. And it will be eventually used to work locomotives, trains, ships, and various factory technology as well. But at this point, not only are steam-powered mechanical devices being put into place, but all kinds of other really exciting mechanized technology for basically processing wool and turning it into thread and then turning that thread into cloth. All of these things are taking leaps and bounds forward. And as the process of producing textiles gets cheaper and cheaper, demand for the raw material, the wool itself, goes higher and higher. Workshops initially and then later factories are buying this stuff up as fast as they can to turn it into textiles that they can then sell not just in England but around the world as an export product. And so because there is a high demand for wool, the price of it goes up and it becomes a really feasible way to make a living, especially if you have acres and acres and acres of land. You could get rid of your tenant farmers because growing oats wasn't producing a lot of money anymore. You could get rid of those farms and put in sheep, and sheep are a lot lower maintenance. All you have to do is have a couple of people to watch them and supervise them and keep them all together, a couple of shepherds. Then seasonally, you have a couple of days a year where you have to shear the sheep and you have to call people in to do that. But generally, sheep more or less take care of themselves. They don't need a lot of tending. And so instead of having, I'm just going to pick random numbers here, instead of having 100 tenant farmers on your estate, you could have 3 permanent shepherd people and seasonal employment of maybe 20 people to shear the sheep. And that would be it. So your expenses would be way lower as a landowner. You have these sheep, they more or less mind their own business. You use them to produce meat and wool, and then ta-da, you end up in a situation where you could make a lot more profit. This is great if you were a landowner. It's great for the overall economy of England, which is going to really begin to flourish and grow at this time. The national product is going to be higher and higher and higher. They're going to be making a lot of money. Unfortunately, that money is not going to be evenly distributed. People who own land are going to do great out of this. People who own factories, as they start to build factories, are going to do great out of this. People who are traditionally tenant farmers end up in serious trouble. There's less and less work. People are turned out of living situations that their great-great-grandparents occupied. And that stable system where people lived on the land and they farmed, and that's mostly how they make a living, starts to break down. And it happens in England first, but the same kind of phenomenon is going to happen in Europe as well. And so if you're in this group of people who can't find work, it becomes a larger and larger problem, because at the same time that the agricultural revolution happens, production of food is cheaper than ever. There's more and more of it on the market. Population starts to spike as well. So it's this really terrible confluence of events. You have a bigger population with less job opportunities than ever before. And so people are kicked off of the land and they have to find some other way to make a living. Some of them are going to find a way to make a living but through migrant farming. They're going to go from place to place and shear sheep and bring in the harvest and just work seasonally. And this is a much more dangerous and difficult and uncertain way of making a living than that great stable medieval remnant where you lived on the land and you were there all year and then you were, busy a few times a year, but for the most part you had, a constant situation. And it's harder for people. And then in addition to that, as the population is higher and jobs are more scarce, more and more people fail to find work at all. So this creates a massive problem, and it was considered at the time to be a serious, like, national crisis of unemployment, where you have people who don't have any place to go, don't necessarily have any place to live, don't have skills other than, and not to say they don't have skills, but they have skills that are suited for farming, and they can't get that kind of work. And so you have a lot of unemployed people trying to figure out what they're going to do. If you can't find work on a farm, what people do naturally enough is travel to cities. And so, as they travel to cities, they're going to start really growing the size of urban populations in England and Scotland and Wales. People start streaming into these towns and cities and growing their populations hugely. And so during the 1700s, you see this explosion as people are leaving the countryside and moving into urban environments that really cannot keep up with the influx of people. They don't have the infrastructure. There aren't enough buildings in town for people to find places to live. There isn't enough sewer system to take care of all of the waste that is being produced. And so living conditions in these cities that start growing and growing and growing tend to be horrifying. You have all of these people cramming in, desperate, looking for work, and they are finding themselves living in these really disgusting, overcrowded, filthy conditions. And that has a couple of consequences. There's a few that are really bad, and at least a couple that are, for long-term economic growth, really, really good. If you have a huge number of unemployed, desperate people looking for some kind of way of making a living, this is a great situation if you wanted to create a workshop, if you wanted to create a factory. You have lots of people who are desperate for something to do, who are desperate to find a way to make a living, and so they will work for next to nothing. So if you have the capital to put together a factory, you can invest in this new equipment, you can take a gamble, and you know that you will have a workforce lining up to produce goods that you can then sell at a tremendous profit. And so this is a great moment if you are a capital investor. This is a great moment if you are a rich person looking to get richer through trade. This is a great moment for the general gross national product of Britain, where they're going to start taking leaps and bounds forward in industrial technology and become leaders in the world in that type of technology and in the profits of that trade. This is a terrible time if you are a working class person looking for a job. Jobs are still highly competitive, even in a factory town where there might be more options. There's not enough to go around, and everybody has to take what they can get. And what they can get are often horrible conditions, dangerous, untested equipment, no kind of safety protocols. Living conditions are, as I mentioned, awful. Overcrowding alone, because people are cramming into these cities where there isn't enough space. You'll find that it is quite common for working class people to live multiple families in a couple of rooms in like what we would consider an apartment with 2 or 3 rooms in it. Might have as many as 20 or 30 people kind of crammed in there living together. They're also scrambling to get enough food to eat, and many people are going hungry and suffering from malnutrition and starvation to some extent. They're also struggling with access to clean water, and not very many people have truly clean water. None of it is being treated in the way that we treat water now, obviously enough, but the water that's accessible to people is very frequently contaminated. There's not really much in the way of organized garbage removal. There's not much in the way of adequate sewer systems. You have open cesspits in these towns, and on top of that, the factories, as they begin being built and expanded, are using steam power. There's nothing wrong with steam power, except that it is being fueled by coal. This is going to be a whole separate thing we're going to get into, this enormous drive and appetite for coal and coal mining. But in the short term, what this means, if you're living in, say, Manchester, Cottonopolis as it comes to be known because you have so many textile factories producing cotton cloth. But if you live in Manchester, you can see from this painting, one of the major characterizing features of this are the smokestacks. Every house is using coal for heat and for cooking and whatnot as well. And what you have is air quality that gets absolutely atrocious. It's just filthy. You just have tons of coal dust, coal smoke just pouring into the environment on top of the general stench of too much humanity crammed into too small a space. The living conditions are horribly, horribly unhealthy. And as a result, disease becomes a massive problem. Every kind of disease you could possibly imagine. Contagious diseases like scarlet fever, typhus, tuberculosis, which is another thing that is people who have terrible air quality are particularly prone to. And on top of that, you have, of course, the contagion situation where you have tons and tons of people living on top of each other, eating poorly, not sleeping enough, and having horrible air quality. You had all kinds of diseases of contaminated water, every kind of dysentery, you have every kind of basically cholera and typhus and horrible, horrible diseases. It's awful. The living conditions are awful. And there are a number of people, and you can see that's what the picture is on the right there, that find this objectionable. There are many detractors to this new kind of growth in factory, this growth in mechanized equipment that produces goods so much more quickly than it was possible to do by hand. And so some people who really resent this shift in way of life try to stand up against it. There are people known as the Luddites who form organized resistance to the development of factories and mechanized workshops. You also have people who are guilty of something. It's this new kind of word of destroying these new machines, the factory equipment. And one of the ways that they destroyed these factory pieces in order to make, hopefully, more work for people to do things the traditional hand way was by taking their wooden shoes and throwing them into the machinery. The wooden shoes that peasants typically wore were called sabots. You can see those, and they wear them all over Europe and in England as well. The reason that traditional agricultural workers wore these was because if you're working with cattle, if you're working with oxen or with horses, you absolutely do have to have some protection for your feet. If you get stepped on by a horse with your bare feet, that's really bad. It's a terrible injury. And so you had to have some protection for your feet. And yet, if you wore like leather shoes or something, they would get so soaked and ruined so quickly with the mud that it wasn't worth it. So people wore these wooden sabots to protect their feet. And so the process, this is just a bit of trivia, where you would try to wreck equipment by throwing your wooden shoe into it so the gears would get clogged up and everything would break. This was known as sabotage, after the wooden shoes. Okay. Okay, so as I've mentioned, you have this problem. You have a lot of unemployed agricultural workers kind of milling around. Some of them are streaming into the cities. Some of them find work, some of them don't. In addition to the problem of just having too many people looking for work, you had people who simply couldn't find work. There really isn't much in the way of established social safety net to figure out what to do with these people who are starving and or turning to alternatives. Now, we haven't really talked about what some of the alternatives might be. If you can't find a job in a factory, you don't really have a lot of choices. You can't find a job on a farm, you can't find a job in a factory, you can't find a job in a workshop. There are a couple of things you might do instead. One of the ways you might make a living if you don't have any specialized skills aside from farming is that you might go into domestic service. And tons of people end up doing this at this time. People go to the city, can't find a job, can't get anything at the factory, and so what they'll try to do is get a job as a maid or a footman, a butler, usually butlers were highly specialized, but you would try to get a job working in somebody's household. And so it becomes something that not just wealthy, noble people had. Noble people in England had always had domestic servants. But it becomes something that anybody who is even marginally well-to-do, if you were slightly middle class, if you were the kind of person where you had a job and you had, general security, economic security, everybody had some kind of servant because labor was so enormously cheap. And so people end up in domestic service, particularly women. Uh, Men, by tradition, had to be paid more, or they at least were paid more. This goes way back to the days of agricultural laborers. If you were to hire extra agricultural labor, the tradition was and went for hundreds of years that men would be paid the most because they could do the most kind of heavy labor, and that women would be paid somewhat less, and that children who could also be hired for agricultural labor, because if you're working on a farm, children were expected to work as well. They would work alongside their families, and they could also do things that were useful. But they would be paid the least, because if you're working on a farm, a child's labor would have the least value. That's traditionally how it worked. And when this transition to urban life happens, those traditional pay scales are kept up. So men had to be paid the most, whether they're working in the factory or whether they're working in domestic service. And so for that reason, if you were kind of middlingly well-to-do, you didn't want to hire men because you had to pay them more. So if you have a task that could just as easily be done by a woman, you would hire a woman if you can. And if you have a task, say you're working in a factory that could be done by a child, you wanted to hire a child because you didn't have to pay them as much. And so this happens in the factories, and it happens in households where women, by and large, are hired at a higher rate than men and then paid less. This is enormously problematic because if women have an easier time getting a job or are the only ones in a family, if you had a family of, that where you have a couple and children, if you're in a situation where only children can get a job or only women can get a job, that means the family's overall income is lower because those people are not making as much money as a man would make if he were hired. And what happens with domestic service as well, men are hired to be domestic servants, but they're hired at lower rates. It was very prestigious to have male servants because they had to be paid more. And so you have tons and tons of women who end up in domestic service, kind of cut off, singular, on their own. We'll get to them in just a minute. So one of the things you could do is you could go into domestic service. One of the things you could do is you could go into factory work. One of the things you could do in terms of an option, if you can't find a job in any of these areas, you have really two major choices. You could go into prostitution, and both men and women do this. Slightly greater percentage of prostitutes are women, as you might imagine. Or you could go into a life of crime. You could become a thief, a robber, a bandit of various types. Slightly more men than women, but both men and women go into this lifestyle as well. And there's a bit of mix and matching for both of those things. These two choices are considered such a threat to polite society, so dangerous, so horrifying, that England has to take legislative steps, or they feel they have to take legislative steps to deal with the problem of unemployment. This itself is an encouraging sign and a sign toward modernity and progress and all those wonderful things, that they're going to try to use parliamentary legislature to figure out what to do with social issues. It's a very new idea. It's not something anybody needed to do in the medieval or early modern period because everyone was very stable living on farms. But now there's this understanding that something needs to be done. The downside is that what they choose to do is make unemployment and homelessness illegal. So in the 1700s, if you don't have a job and you don't have somewhere to live, you are now officially a criminal. And as a result of being a criminal, you can be arrested and put in a workhouse. It's very difficult to find a picture of a workhouse. Most of them have been destroyed because they are now considered a blight on England's history. But workhouses were basically pseudo-prisons. They're set up sort of like prison institutions. If you're put in a workhouse, you're not free to come and go. You're stuck in there. They'd find some kind of a job, menial labor for you to do, that you would then be productive, producing textiles or shoes or whatever it is that you made. And you would live in horrifyingly terrible conditions while you did this. And that was deliberate. They put people in workhouses, fed them next to nothing, made them live in horrifyingly terrible conditions, all crammed on top of each other with very little heat. And People got sick like you would not believe and died. It was kind of a place where they put you and then forgot about you. That was the goal. Now, they're not exactly prisons. If you had somebody who would vouch for you, they could get you out of the workhouse anytime. You're not like given this as a penalty for 10 years or something. You're just stuck in the workhouse as long as you have nowhere else to go. You're expected to just kind of live out your life and die there, is what most people do. But if there was anybody who could get you out, if you had a relative or somebody that was willing to come down and vouch for you and say, yeah, that's Joe, he can come live with me and I'll give him a job, they would just release you immediately. But most of the time, when people went into the workhouses, they didn't come out. This was England's kind of desperate attempt to try to figure out what to do so you didn't have the crime and the general chaos of having wandering unemployed people. It was, I guess, an effort in the right direction, but it was, of course, the most horrible, brutal way they could have thought of to deal with this as an issue. Okay, so political developments. Armies and navies, just as we have talked about in class many times up to this point, are continuing their ongoing march toward modernity. There's new weapons. They're moving into musket style. Firearms is being common issue to the armies and using them all over the place. They're improving rifles, they're improving cannons, they're improving all kinds of things. Armies are getting ever larger and growing in size, and they are back on the field. The 30 Years' War is now a memory. And so they're back on the field and they're putting them together, and all the major nations of Europe are busy building up and reinforcing their armed forces. This is a moment when it's not lost on the elite classes, it's not lost on the ruling classes that there is tension. There's political tension, there's social tension, there's economic tension, and many of the leaders of European nations are using this moment to prepare for what they see as an inevitable conflict. In Prussia, Prussia's one of those German principalities, one of those little countries in the middle of Central Europe that were caught kind of on their own after the 30 Years' War. They're the largest of them, and they begin really consolidating. The King of Prussia begins really investing enormously heavily in a modern army. He's pulling it together, he is modernizing all of his equipment, and he is drumming absolutely everybody he can think of into it. So of eligible men, people who are in the kind of age range that could be drummed into the army, nearly 1 in 6 in Prussia are being called upon to actively serve in the army. It's an ungodly proportion. It's huge. And the goal of this for Prussia was to go from being a relatively small little place in Europe where nobody really thought about them as one of the great nations, as having it to go from that into a situation where they have an army that is comparable, if not superior, to the armies of France or Russia or England. That's the goal. And it's so actively pursued that Voltaire makes a joke about it. Whereas some states possess an army, the Prussian army possesses a state, that really everything the government does in Prussia is just running the army. And then it just happened to have this land on the side note. Well, in 1756, this militarization kind of boils into an open conflict known as the 7 Years' War. This is a major fight that is going to take place between several European countries and their colonial territories. Okay, so the 7 Years' War is going to be fought on 2 major battlefields. There's going to be one in Europe itself. Prussia, you can probably see right here, is this part right there in Central Europe. And when war breaks out, it's going to be between Prussia and the countries that find Prussia most threatening. Logically enough, those are going to be the big nations that surround it. You've got Russia, Austria, and France. All of these 3 countries find Prussia's expansion to be offensive, they find it to be a threat, and so they're going to gang up and end up fighting against the Prussian army. Now, Prussia really only has one ally, that's going to be Britain, and this is why it ends up turning into something of a global conflict. While Prussia is going to do most of the heavy lifting in terms of land battles in Europe, Britain, its ally, is going to invest most of its efforts in the Navy. And they're also especially going to be focusing some of their Navy efforts on thwarting France in the New World. Britain's motives for this have a lot to do with the fact that France and Britain have had this ongoing fight, this squabble over the Jacobite rebellions, over all of the tensions that have been brewing between the two of them. And so this seems like a great opportunity to side with Prussia, which will give them the go-ahead to go and mess with the French in the New World. So Britain is going to sail on over here, and they're going to bankroll their colonies, drum up militias out of the colonists. They're going to send over tons of supplies and weapons and military generals to train these colonial militias, and they're going to get them to go and fight against the French colonists in North America as well. Both sides are going to call upon Native Americans to work as allies. They're going to bribe and come up with treaties and all that kind of jazz in order to make that happen. And so in the American conflict, this is sometimes referred to in American history textbooks as the French and Indian War. It's a little bit of a misleading name because it's the British colonists and their Native American allies versus the French colonists and their Native American allies, I guess, is what the conflict boils down to in North America. It, however, is just part of a branch of this broader conflict that's happening in Europe as well. So the whole thing is something we call the 7 Years' War. Now, the major combatants on the side of, in Europe, on the side of against Prussia, we've got Empress Elizabeth of Russia. She's the ruler there, the Tsarina. We have Louis XV of France, somewhat ineffectual, not a great military commander, and the Empress Maria Theresa of Austria. Maria Theresa has a fascinating personal history, but we're not going to get into it at any point. She is going to be spearheading this attempt to control the expansion of Prussia, as she finds it very threatening. She's the inheritor of the Habsburg, the great Holy Roman Empire crown, if you will. That's where she comes into all of this. And these three people are going to be lined up against George II of England and Frederick II of Prussia. And these two sides are going to face off against each other. Now, as I've mentioned, England is going to take part in the 7 Years' War, but they're going to do very little fighting in Europe itself. They're going to focus a lot of their efforts on the New World. The reason they decided to do this, of course, as I did mention, is partly just to stick it to France. They're looking for a chance to do that, and partly because there is a connection between the two. If you remember, the Georges are known as the Hanoverians because their family originally comes from Hanover. And they're cousins, and everybody is, but they're cousins, and they have some connection as well to the kings of Prussia. So they see this as kind of a natural alliance. It makes sense at this moment, and lines up with their political goals. So, what happens in the 7 Years' War? Initially, the Prussians have a good deal of success. Their army is not to be trifled with, and they're going to engage their opponents, and they're going to take, at first, some victories. But then, once Austria and Russia and France join together to form a coalition, what happens is that this momentum shifts and Prussia begins to lose ground. They start being defeated in battles and pushed back. It's just too much in terms of the odds. The numbers just are too unbalanced, and so Prussia starts losing ground. They start retreating and retreating. They have to fight and fight. They're losing and losing and losing. Meanwhile, over in North America, Britain has been heavily investing, as I mentioned, in backing up their colonists and colonial militias there. France has not been able to do that because France is busy fighting Prussia in Europe. So what happens is that the British are going to win ground. They're going to win battles. They're going to take over territory. They're going to be quite successful, where the French can't really pull together a significant organized resistance to them. They try, they put up a good fight, but they can't actually hold the British off. And so the British are winning, but meanwhile, their allies, the Prussians in Europe, are losing. So it's a bit of a mixed bag. Then, right on the cusp of total victory for Russia and Austria and France, they have Prussia up against the wall. They have totally gotten the upper hand. They are about to defeat and crush Prussia once and for all. The Empress Elizabeth dies, and her son, Peter III, inherits. This is one of those rare moments in history where a single person's idiosyncratic choices affect the whole trajectory of world history. Here we go. Peter III was obsessed with Prussia. He's a relative, everybody is, but he really thinks the King of Prussia's armies are the finest and most modern and most wonderful armies, greatest in the world. He thinks the King of Prussia is the smartest, most brilliant military mind in the world. He thinks that everything ought to be like Prussia. He loves Prussia. He loves the King of Prussia. He thinks everything is great. So when he inherits the throne, even though his country is on the brink of winning a war against Prussia, he decides to quit. He just informs his generals, we're suing for peace, we're not asking for any concessions, we're just quitting the war on the brink of victory. Bye. So this 7 years war where we have just lost, Lord only knows how many people and all the money and all the huge investment we have just put into winning this war against Prussia, we're just going to stop and give up. And he has to tell France and Austria that he's doing this. By the way, we have this whole three-pronged strategy where we've got Prussia beat. I'm just going to leave, and you two are on your own. As you can imagine, this is not an announcement that was greeted with any kind of pleasure by either his allies or his own military command. Telling your military generals, we're just quitting a war that we're winning right on the brink of victory, is not a real wise thing to do. They're furious at him. They have no faith in him. They don't trust him. They don't like him. They are so angry at having thrown lives away on this conflict that he's just going to quit for no reason. And then, on the flip side, France is incandescent with rage against him, as is the Empress of Austria. They are furious at Peter. So he's in this situation where he is the Tsar of Russia. He has just made a choice that is unpopular with his military, very dangerous to do, unpopular with his allies, unpopular is probably putting it mildly. He has really just burned his bridges with half of Western Europe. And then on top of that, it's unpopular with the common people as well. So if he doesn't have his military elite to call on, and doesn't have common people to call on, and he doesn't have any international allies to call on, Peter's put himself in a tight spot, but he does it anyway because he is evidently crazy. I mean, that's really the only thing that we can use to describe what his thought process is here. He did have smallpox relatively late in life, and it is possible he had some brain damage as a result of that. One isn't entirely clear. But what happens initially in the 7 Years' War is that right at the point where they would have beaten Prussia and forced Prussia and its ally Britain to give some kind of concessions up as a result of losing this war, what happens is that France and Austria, without Russia's support, just feel like they can't go on. They're like, oh, we just can't continue this strategy that we've had going on. It's probably best for us to sue for peace as well. So here's the thing that's going to change the trajectory of history. France and Austria sue for peace. Prussia doesn't have to give anything up. They have to restore their boundaries to kind of pre-war boundaries, but they don't have to surrender their army. They don't have to disband anything or kind of demilitarize, or have huge swaths of territory taken. They don't lose anything. So even though they lose the war more or less, they kind of get out of it. They weasel out of it and don't actually have to face the consequences of losing. Meanwhile, also, the British that had won all those territorial advances in North America, they don't have to give that up either, because instead of being allied to Prussia, who loses a war, they're just allied to Prussia, who has just kind of come to terms and quit the war. And so Britain is now in a position in North America to seize almost all of France's North American territories. France is going to hang on to land officially that's along the Mississippi Basin, but all of what is now in Canada, basically, falls under the British colonial rule as a result of this. And so they're going to seize that up very happily and claim it for themselves. And this is going to expand Britain's colonial empire, and it's going to put them in a higher and more significant position going forward. So, as I've mentioned, Prussia is going to retain its territory over here, and they're going to continue causing problems. We'll get to them in a bit. Meanwhile, if you can see the yellow, the British are going to consolidate and claim much more land over in North America. As a result of that, they are going to be in a position to capitalize on many of the sort of resources that New France had, the fur trade, but also the timber trade, which Britain is going to be buying up in huge quantities in order to build more and more ships for their huge shipping industry. It's going to be a big deal for them. It's also going to really it's going to have some consequences for colonists. Those colonists who are left in New France, many of them are going to leave in another wave. They're going to leave, some of them already had. They're going to leave and travel to New Orleans and elsewhere in New France. Some of them are going to end up in other places. Others are going to integrate relatively awkwardly into British rule. We'll talk about that a bit later as well. So there's a bit of a mix-up. There's a bit of a stir-up. There's all things that are changing. It's all very exciting. Okay, so some other immediate consequences to world history. Peter III's decision to just quit the 7 Years' War is going to set himself up for serious consequences back at home. Taking off your military elite is a very unwise decision. And Peter does this because his military commanders, now the great truth of history is he or she who controls the military controls the state. That's the truth. And Peter, what he's done is he's burned his bridges with the military. They don't have any confidence in him. They don't trust him. And so they are going to back his wife, Catherine, in a coup to remove him from power. Catherine has friends and supporters in the military administration. She's going to rally them up together. She's going to get the support of the rest of the Army and Navy. And so she's just going to make a move. And she's going to take Peter off the throne and announce that he has a sudden, unexpected desire to retire to a monastery, and she will take over Russia on behalf of their young son. Peter mysteriously dies in the monastery. No one's entirely clear whether that's of natural causes or not. No one entirely cares. What happens is that Catherine takes over Russia, declares herself, she will ultimately be known as Catherine the Great, and she is going to move Russia into exciting new directions. Well, not entirely new, but she is going to pick up where Peter could not. She's ultimately going to be known as the Enlightened Despot because she is very much like Peter the First, Peter the Great. She's very much interested in moving Russia into a more modern direction and to meshing their culture more firmly with Western Europe. So she's going to invest, much like Peter the Great did, in more trade, in more shipping, in more kind of early factories. They're very early at this point, and investing in urban infrastructure. She's going to finance all kinds of stuff. From the arts, theaters and museums and various scientific institutes that she's going to pay for and bankroll new universities for people to study, including, and this is significant, she's going to create something called the Smolny Institute, which is the first institution of higher learning, so above what we would think of as like high school level. So a university level institution that is open to women. And so it exists to train women in things like physics and astronomy and literature and all those kinds of wonderful things. So the Smolny Institute is created for that reason. She's going to pay for all of these innovations, building projects, modernization, opening up, increasing correspondence with Western Europe. And just like Peter the Great, she's going to have to find a way to pay for that. And just like Peter the Great, she's going to repeat what we'll find out is a bit of a mistake. She's going to convince the Russian nobles that they should back her on the throne and should pay for her reforms by giving them increasing legal rights over their serfs. She's going to take this modernization and pay for it with the I guess almost enslavement, the further tying legally and socially and politically of the peasant class to their landlords. And this, in the long, long run, is going to backfire horribly. It's also going to have some resistance right in this at the moment. In the same time, there's going to be a few rebellions in the 1700s against Catherine's rule, especially against this process of making the serfs more legally tied to their landlords. The most famous of them is known as the Pugachev Rebellion, which in 1774 is going to be ultimately put down. It's very curious. There's this guy, Pugachev, who claims to be Peter III, even though he's a Cossack and ethnically obviously not Peter III. Nevertheless, he claims to be Peter III, and on his behalf, he foments a rebellion against Catherine. And their demands are for greater freedom and rights for the serfs. They want greater sort of freedom and rights for over land usage. They want to see a reversal of some of Catherine's more tyrannical policies. And ultimately what happens is that he gets killed and the rebellion is slaughtered and put down brutally. And this is where Catherine gets her somewhat odd reputation. On the one hand, she's very interested in Enlightenment philosophy. She's very interested in literature. She's very interested in political science. She's very interested in education. She's very interested in promoting all of these things. She's very interested in this kind of open exploration of kind of French literature and philosophy. She corresponds with Voltaire and is like a pen pal of his. But at the same time, she puts forward this ideal of almost absolute monarchy, and she crushes anyone who gets in her way. That's what despot means, is a tyrant. She's the enlightened despot. Okay, so in France, there's some serious fallout from the 7 Years' War as well. France was already kind of broke, and the 7 Years' War puts them right over the top. They can't pay for it. They fought this war, and on the cusp of victory, where they could have demanded concessions, where they could have gotten some loot, where they could have gotten something out of winning, they quit just because Russia quit, and so now they're just kind of stuck. They've also lost territory in North America because the British were able to back their colonists because they weren't busy in fighting in Europe. The French weren't, and so now they've lost that income as well. And so the French treasury is freaking empty, but they don't stop spending money. As you can see, this is the kind of court dress that was popular at the time. It's so huge. You can see Marie Antoinette's dress there. The human body isn't big enough to actually support this much fabric, so they have to wear these panniers, these kind of wicker baskets structures that you can then drape your skirts over to make them even bigger. And so they're dressing like this is the days of Versailles and Louis XIV, but it's not like that anymore, and there's increasing resentment of this in public. Every time you see the king and queen go trouncing through town in their carriage and they're dressed to the nines, they're dripping with jewels, at the same time that there's constant demands for more tax money from people who are already broke. Food shortages become a major problem. There's some bad weather issues, and as well as war shortages. And so food prices go through the roof. It's expensive, and Paris suffers the most because they have to import so much of their food. And so the working class in Paris is desperately trying to get enough bread together to live on, to have enough calories to live, and they're failing in some cases. People are hungry. Hungry people become desperate people really fast. And so there's all this rioting, there's anger, there's distress and distrust of the government because they're not really doing anything. There's this desperation to raise money, and they're not really sure how they're going to do that. The royal family becomes a focus of a lot of rage and unpopularity, because they're seen as so detached and so oblivious to the suffering of the people of France. Some of the same tensions were happening in England as well. Even though England does not have an absolute or even pretense at absolute monarchy, they have a parliament with a House of Commons as well as a House of Lords. Nevertheless, there was a good deal of dissatisfaction in England as well. There was a lot of popularity of presses that were publishing things like John Locke, who was, of course, making arguments about government only being legitimate with the consent of the governed. There was a great deal of distress, in particular, about the franchise, about who had the right to vote for the House of Commons in England. For the most part, this was strictly limited in the 1700s, in the mid-1700s, by property concerns and by traditional sort of legal restrictions. And so only a very small percentage of the population actually had the right to vote. And that small percentage was very much frequently under the thumb of noble patrons. And so even though it was the House of Commons, the people who got elected to Parliament weren't necessarily quite as independent of the nobility as you might hope. There was a movement at the time spearheaded by a guy named John Wilkes, who had a very colorful kind of history and was a colorful character, who was a member of the House of Commons and who was famous for being a leader in this movement to expand the franchise. That's something that he put forward and really advocated for. as well as a Bill of Rights that guaranteed people's legal protections in England. And Wilkes was infamous. This is just kind of a funny story as an aside for his social interactions. He was a little bit odd. He called himself the ugliest man in England. I don't know that that's true, but he had a lazy eye and was a little bit odd looking apparently. But he would then say that it only took him a quarter of an hour to talk his way past his face because he was very persuasive and eloquent and people found him charming. One of the famous stories about him was that he was attending one of his clubs. At the time, if you were a political muckety-muck, if you wanted to be influential in business or in politics in England, you really kind of had to belong to one of several clubs, or preferably several of several clubs in England where gentlemen would circulate. And they were kind of an odd institution, but they would be these places. They'd have a club building, and they were just for men only. And you could go there, and they have rooms where you could stay if you were staying in London, say, to, I don't know, attend Parliament for a few days or a few weeks or whatever, while you had your main residence someplace else. They also had places where you could play billiards and cards and drink and smoke and talk to other men about politics without having to worry about your wives and children being underfoot. And so these were places where a lot of business got done. And so if you wanted to be important, you had to belong to these clubs. And at one of these, John Wilkes came walking in. And as he walked in, he encountered one of his political rivals, John Montague, who was the Earl of Sandwich. The sandwich is named after him. I'll just continue on the digression, I suppose you could say, because according to legend, John Montague loved playing cards so much that he didn't want to stop in order to have something to eat, but he was hungry one day. And so he turns to the waiter at his club and says, "I'd like you to bring me some roast beef in between 2 slices of bread," so that he could hold it with one hand and continue playing cards, not having to stop. And his companion, who was playing cards with him, looked over at the waiter and said, "That sounds great. I'll have as sandwich." And then because the two S's kind of are together, they kind of smush together. And this phenomenon of having meat and bread together became known as a sandwich. Anyway, John Montague, Earl of Sandwich, sees John Wilkes come in. And John Wilkes has this reputation for being this radical rogue kind of guy. And so he yells across the room, "Wilkes, I don't know whether you'll die of the pox or on the gallows." And when he said the pox, he meant syphilis, which was increasingly a problem in England. And of course, he's making this joke about John Wilkes's radical behavior, and it's going to lead to a bad end. And John Wilkes, without missing a beat, yells back across the room at him, "Well, that very much depends, Your Grace, on whether I embrace your morals or your mistresses." So, yeah, anyway. That was considered very funny at the time. You might or might not consider it funny. At any rate, he promotes the idea of the expansion of franchise. So here's what happens in 1763. He was talking about this in perhaps too provocative a way. He is accused of treason, of speaking against the crown for his radical talk. He's arrested and convicted and sentenced to exile as his punishment. So he's kicked out of England. He leaves England, but there's a parliamentary election where he stands for election even though he's in exile, and he's elected. He wins. And so as a big political movement, he turns around and comes back to England openly, not as a secret, to take his seat at the House of Parliament, kind of forcing the government to arrest him and then basically creating a showdown. So he's arrested and he's put in prison. And here he is. He's in prison for advocating that the common man has the right to vote, or should have the right to vote. And he's this great champion of the ordinary person. And when he's arrested and put into prison, even though he'd been elected to Parliament legitimately, there's rioting in the streets of London. And there's so much tension and there's so much anger, and stuff gets destroyed, and it becomes so clear that this is a dangerous situation that the king relents and actually has to issue him a pardon and let him out. And he does take his seat in Parliament, and he's going to then continue to be a champion for the expansion of the franchise. And he's also, this is kind of a side note, going to be very highly critical of the upcoming war with the American colonies, which we'll get to in just a bit. At any rate, what the Wilkes Affair, which is what this whole thing was called, illustrates is just how close to the surface tensions in England were as well. Even though England is not on the cusp of an outright revolution, that wasn't really clear in 1763. There was a lot of political dissent and a lot of political unhappiness there. It was a delicate situation even in England itself. Then, in terms of the aftermath of the 7 Years' War, what's happened as a result in the Americas? Well, the British have taken over more territory and they're going to consolidate control over that. Some of the other consequences, however, have to do with the military preparedness and confidence level of British colonists. They had been organized into militias and they had experience fighting in a war in the 7 Years' War, and this gives them a lot of weapons that are in their hands because they had them and were issued them to fight. It also gives them a sense of expertise. They have a lot of militias that are well organized and understand how to conduct warfare. This gives them a great deal of confidence, military confidence. This picture here depicts on the white horse there, that's Major George Washington when he fought in the 7 Years' War. And at the end of this fight, when they had been so successful and they had won so many gains and so much territory had been captured, colonial militias feel at the end of it as though they ought to be respected as veterans and given kind of deference to that. They also feel like perhaps, and this is just an idea that's circulated in certain circles, that the British colonists ought to have some kind of representation in British Parliament as well, but they don't. They really are kind of kept as separate. And this is an interesting phenomenon about the British colonies. Now, I mentioned in a couple of lectures ago, that when England was setting up its North American colonies, it does it kind of piecemeal. They'll issue a charter, and some of them are crown colonies that are set up directly by the king or queen. Some of them are set up as merchant colonies, kind of as an attempt to, like in Virginia, set up colonies where they just make a bunch of cash. Some of them are religious separatist colonies, like Massachusetts. They're all kind of doing their own thing. And over the years, England launches these colonies out, and then they go through that whole period with the Civil War and a great deal of chaos in England itself. And as a result of that, they just kind of left their colonies to do their own thing. And in the absence of much in the way of direct interference from Britain, what the colonies have done is set up their own legislatures. They've created their own houses of government. In Virginia, it's the House of Burgesses. Elsewhere, they have other names, but they basically set up their own legislatures. Their own people are elected to choose. They basically vote amongst themselves as to who they want their leadership to be. They pass their own laws. They enforce their own laws. They've just been kind of doing their own thing. They don't pay taxes to Britain, and they don't get anything directly from Britain as well in terms of law enforcement or border protection or really anything. They've just been kind of doing their own thing, with a few exceptions, but basically on their own. After the 7 Years' War, this relationship comes into question. And the British colonists feel like, oh, we're now accomplished veterans of this war, and we've done a lot, and we should be able to continue what we've been doing before with perhaps more recognition from Britain. On the flip side, the King of England thinks, I just spent a ton of money defending our colonial interests in North America, but it occurs to me I don't actually have a lot of control over our colonial interests in North America. They're setting their own laws. They don't pay any taxes directly. I don't know if this is 100% what we want. We should at least try to recoup some of the expenses that we have just laid out in fighting the 7 Years' War. So they attempt to pass some legislation that would require the colonists to pay tax in one way or another. One of these that's famous, if you take an American history, you'll cover all of this in much more detail. But one of these is the Stamp Act, passed in 1764, in which there's an effort to create tax revenue by requiring anything that is officially certified by the British government. And that was a long list. Everything from like title deed documents to playing cards had to have an official stamp on it that said this is the official stamp of the British government, we certify this is good. And anytime you bought something with a stamp on it, that was supposed to come with a little extra tax that you had to pay for the stamp, and that would then ultimately end up in the treasury of Britain. Well, once the Stamp Act was passed, there was a huge resistance to it. Number one, nobody likes paying taxes, and so part of it was just that people didn't want to have to pay taxes when they didn't traditionally do that. But part of it had to do with the precedent as well. So especially leaders of colonial legislatures were very alert to this and very concerned that imposing taxation in a small way might lead to imposing taxation and then perhaps governance in a big way. And what if you were a leader of colonial government, what you didn't want was Britain exercising and flexing more of its muscles to exercise more control over colonial governments and over the colonies in particular. You did not want some governor being dispatched from England to come and take over, because that would mean that you would lose your influence and your power and your independence. They didn't want that. And so tensions begin to rise, and they really consolidate around this idea that we should resist taxation because it's a slippery slope that's going to lead to Britain ruling us. And so there's all this outcry and complaint about it. Patrick Henry very famously gives a speech that comes to be known as the Treason Speech in the House of Burgesses in Virginia, where he is a leader. And in it, he famously says, Caesar had his Brutus, Charles had his Cromwell, George III, and then it breaks off, and where the ellipses are there, people start shouting treason, treason. And then ultimately he finishes, George III may profit by their example. Well, this is a really bold thing to say, because Brutus was one of the assassins that kills Caesar. Cromwell executes Charles. So they're not even talking about resistance here. We're talking about deaths of kings. At any rate, that's the kind of language that's being circulated. I see another example of that kind of a reaction in 1773 when the Stamp Act had been revoked. It was so unpopular, didn't go over well. But the King of England decides, all right, well, maybe we'll go a tariff route. And so they impose a tax on tea. It was considered a luxury good. It was something that wasn't produced in the Americas. And so they're like, well, we'll just put a tax on tea. It was very popular as it in American colonies as it was in the rest of British colonial world. And so they figured this would be a good way to raise money. Well, there was resistance to that too for much the same reasons. And of course that sparks the Tea Party we're familiar with, where a bunch of colonial well-to-do people really they dress up offensively enough as Native Americans, break onto these ships carrying tea, steal the tea, and dump it into the harbor in Boston because they refuse to pay any kind of tariffs and raise money that way, objecting in principle to the principle that Britain would have any right to tax its colonies. So there's a great deal of anger and resistance, and a lot of this is sort of proactive. It's not so much that people really resent having to pay taxes. They are paying taxes to their colonial governments. It's that they don't want to set up a precedent where they're paying taxes to Britain directly. So in 1774, there's so much concern that the First Continental Congress is summoned. Well, not all, but a great deal of the important people, colonial legislator leaders, people who are well-to-do and significant and socially important. Samuel Adams, and these are they are generally speaking wealthy people. Samuel Adams was a brewer in Boston. Thomas Jefferson was a huge landowner in Virginia. George Washington was an ex-military guy in the 7 Years' War and also a big landowner in Virginia. A lot of the leaders of the First Continental Congress are in that same class of people, people who are extremely wealthy, who have a lot to lose, who are currently the leaders running colonial legislatures. They get together in Philadelphia in 1774, and they come up with really kind of two resolutions. First, they petition George III for tax relief. They're going to send an official letter of request to the king saying, we don't want to pay taxes, we shouldn't have to pay taxes, we're not going to pay taxes, we want you to repeal any and all idea of taxing us. Second of all, they agreed that they're going to meet again next year. That's really all that's accomplished at the First Continental Congress. So, what happens is that this tension is going to boil over into open conflict. George III begins ramping up his efforts. He knows which way the wind is blowing. He knows that rebellion is in the air. So he begins summoning in units of troops, regular British regimentals, stationing them in the colonies and preparing to take steps to try to take over more control over colonial legislatures. You see some of the complaints about this in the Declaration of Independence, where he's trying to assert more dominance. He's trying to assert more direct governmental control. And he begins moving troops in with the expectation that he's going to have to use them to control the colonies. And he begins billeting them in people's houses. This is another thing that Jefferson complains about. And what that means is that instead of building a barracks and having people, the soldiers live in them, what he does is this is a common enough practice at the time, will have his soldiers live in people's houses where somebody just knocks on the door and says, "Hi, congratulations, a soldier is going to live with you, British subject, and that you have no choice about whether you agree or you disagree, and you have to feed them and you have to let them live in your house, and you'll be paid a small stipend in return for that." And this is a common enough occurrence, as I mentioned, especially in emergency situations. If you have to move an army around rapidly, this is often the best and most efficient way to house them. But it was perceived with a great deal of angst at the time, because the soldiers had been brought in to not to fight any kind of external enemy, but openly enough to suppress any potential rebellion. And so housing them in people's houses was meant to be an intimidation tactic. It was not received very well, and many people resent it deeply. Colonial militias began practicing and refining their skills that they learned during the 7 Years' War with the expectation that they might have to use them again. They began stockpiling weapons and preparing for resistance to the British efforts to perhaps consolidate legal control over the colonies. And so what happens in 1775 is that the British troops were sent out to seize a stockpile of weapons, but they were the colonial militias were tipped off. This is that Paul Revere, very famous incident, where they find out ahead of time the British are coming, and he goes galloping through the town and warns the colonial militias who turn out in a minute and run down to the field. And when the British troops show up to seize the stockpile of weapons, they are met by a militia who is mobilized to resist them, and shots are fired. This is referred to by Ralph Waldo Emerson as the shot heard round the world, because this ultimately is going to open the military hostilities between Great Britain and British colonies and their British colonists. And so what happens as a result of this is that George III is going to begin taking steps to launch a proper military suppression of rebellion, as he sees it, in the New World and on British colonies. Meanwhile, those colonists are going to do the same thing. The Second Continental Congress is going to be summoned, and in this, the Declaration of Independence will be issued, and we'll talk about what happens as a result next time. Yay!